They said we'd be home by Christmas, that this would be the last push, the one that broke Germany's back. But in war, promises have the lifespan of smoke. I remember the sound, said one old veteran, his voice thin with age. Not the gunfire, the bridge. It breathed under us. A pause. Then an explosion cracks through the memory. Silence. The sound of shuffling paper. Arnhem. September 17, 1944. Operation Market Garden begins. It started as the boldest plan of the war, an airborne strike through the Netherlands, leapfrogging rivers and canals to open a clear road into the heart of Germany. Field Marshal Montgomery called it the single thrust to end the war. On paper, it looked perfect. Arrows sweeping north, red lines converging like veins of certainty. To the men preparing to jump, it felt like salvation. In the damp morning light, hundreds of C-47 Dakotas roared over English airfields, their bellies heavy with paratroopers, the Red Beret men of the British 1st Airborne Division. They joked, they sang, they checked and rechecked their gear. Above the engines, someone shouted, "We'll be in Berlin in 3 days." The laughter that followed was half belief, half denial. Major General Robert Urquhart stood beside his jeep on the tarmac, wind whipping his coat, watching his men climb aboard. He knew the odds, though he didn't say it aloud. Intelligence reports had whispered of German armor regrouping near Arnhem, veterans from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions resting after Normandy. But higher command called it a calculated risk. They wanted speed. They got faith instead. The planes climbed into the gray sky, the formation stretching for miles, the largest airborne armada in history. Below, England slipped away into the mist. Ahead, the flat green lands of Holland, sliced with rivers that glittered like blades. Somewhere over the North Sea, the first anti-aircraft fire found them, black flowers blooming in the sky. One Dakota lurched, its right wing aflame, men tumbling into the air before their parachutes could open. Another spiraled down, silent until it hit the ground. Inside the remaining planes, no one spoke. Then the light blinked green. The jump doors opened, and the sky filled with bodies. Thousands of white canopies blossomed at once, floating down through sunlight and smoke. To the people of the Netherlands, it must have looked like angels falling. To the men inside it, it felt like freefall into a question mark. I remember thinking, one paratrooper later said, the ground was coming up too fast. And maybe that wasn't the ground. Maybe it was a trap waiting for us. They landed in open fields outside Arnhem, scattered by the wind. The air smelled of grass, diesel, and cordite. Locals came running. Old men waving Dutch flags, children shouting, "Welcome, welcome." A woman handed a soldier an apple. It felt like liberation. For a few minutes, it was. Then came the distant rumble. Tanks, faint but certain. Radio contact crackled and died. The battalion commanders tried to reach headquarters, but the signals vanished into static. "Keep moving to the bridge," Urquhart ordered. "Link with the Americans coming from the south." The message echoed through the ranks. The objective was simple on paper. Seize the Arnhem Bridge, hold it for 2 days, then wait for the armored columns of XXX Corps to arrive from Belgium. 2 days. That was all. In the headquarters back in England, the mood was buoyant. Cigarettes, tea, confident chatter. "The Dutch will open the roads for us," someone said. "We'll be in the Ruhr by week's end." The arrows on the wall map already touched the Rhine. But on the ground, reality had sharper edges. In the distance, the bridge shimmered through haze, long, steel, alive in the sunlight. The men who saw it first stopped without meaning to. It wasn't just metal. It was a line between faith and failure. One young lieutenant, barely 23, stared at it and said, "A bridge in Holland isn't Berlin. We'll have it in 3 days." The narrator's voice cuts in quiet. He wasn't wrong about the 3 days, just about what would happen in them. The first gunfire came from the far bank, short, measured bursts. A lorry exploded near the leading platoon, showering the road with gravel and glass. The paratroopers dived for cover, returning fire. Civilians vanished into doorways. Somewhere, a church bell kept ringing as if the city refused to understand what was coming. By nightfall, the first British units reached the outskirts of Arnhem. The sky glowed red behind them, smoke from burning fields drifting like veils over the river. Frost's battalion would push forward in the morning. They believed help was close behind. They believed the bridge could be held. On the operations map, the red arrows still pointed forward. Only one thin line of blue separated them from victory. A single river, one bridge. It looked so close that no one noticed the gap widening between plan and reality. The narrator's voice, low and measured. By morning, that bridge would be the only thing still holding. And it would breathe like a living creature under the weight of men who refused to let it go. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Arnhem, September 18th, 1944. The city woke to the sound of distant thunder, not from the sky, but from the ground. German engines. By dawn, Colonel John Frost and his men of the 2nd Battalion, the parachute regiment, had reached the northern end of the bridge. 700 soldiers out of the thousands who had dropped over Holland. They were the farthest anyone had made it. The bridge stretched above them like the spine of a steel beast. To the south, beyond the mist, lay the road that led to Nijmegen and then to the waiting tanks of XXX Corps. In theory, Frost stood at the corner of Eusebiusstraat, binoculars pressed to his face. The bridge gleamed in the weak sunlight, its arches fading into haze. "We hold here," he said simply. "Whatever comes, we hold." The men spread through the buildings at the bridgehead, red brick townhouses, a cafe, a laundry, a school. They blocked the windows with furniture and sandbags, dragged wounded into basements. Civilians whispered prayers in the stairwells as the soldiers took position. The air smelled of oil and fear. At 10:15, the first German scout car appeared on the far side of the bridge, moving cautiously, its machine gun swiveling. A single British PIT shell hit it squarely. It burned for an hour. But behind it came more, armored cars, half-tracks, the dark silhouettes of tanks. The men in the windows could see the black crosses glinting on their hulls. "Panzer units," Frost murmured. So the rumors were true. The bridge trembled as the first shells landed. Glass shattered. Dust poured from ceilings. In one house, a young corporal named Evans clutched his rifle so tightly that his knuckles went white. "They said armor wasn't near Arnhem," he said. The sergeant beside him spat dust and replied, "Then they lied." Through the afternoon, the fighting turned the city into a furnace. British machine guns rattled from upstairs windows. German mortars replied in waves. By sunset, half of Frost's men were dead, wounded, or deaf from the bombardment. Still, the bridge held. From the far bank, loudspeakers blared a German voice. "English soldiers, surrender the bridge. You are surrounded." The reply came from a single rifle shot. Then silence. In the headquarters back in Eindhoven, the mood was still confident. Radio operators tried again and again to reach the paratroopers in Arnhem. All they heard was static. Someone joked, "They're too busy celebrating." The laughter sounded wrong even as it left his mouth. No one there knew that the Germans had jammed the frequencies, that Frost and his men were already isolated, fighting blind. By night, Arnhem burned. The bridge's metal frame glowed faintly red from the fires below. Civilians fled through the alleys carrying children, their faces gray with soot. Somewhere, a church organ still played, a priest refusing to abandon his post. Inside one of the defensive houses, Captain Eric Mackay wrote a brief note in his diary. No sign of armor. No word from HQ. Bridge still ours. Morale steady. God help us if they bring more tanks. The next morning, they did. At 6:30 a.m., the low growl of engines came from the south. Through the smoke, the paratroopers saw them, a line of German half-tracks rolling onto the bridge, supported by Tiger tanks. "Hold your fire," Frost ordered. "Wait till they're close." When they were halfway across, the British unleashed everything they had. Piats fired from rooftops, Bren guns spat from windows, and grenades arced through the smoke. The first Tiger was hit on its track and stopped dead, blocking the bridge. Flames climbed from its turret, lighting the scene like a sunrise made of fire. For a brief, impossible moment, it looked like victory. Then the German artillery answered. Shells fell across the bridgehead in a storm. One house collapsed completely, burying 6 men alive. Another burst into flames, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of explosions. Civilians screamed as they tried to drag the wounded through smoke. By midday, Frost's 700 had dwindled to fewer than 500. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were gone. The wounded begged for morphine. The doctors had none left. Still, no one spoke of surrender. I can still see him, one survivor would later say. Frost standing in the street, revolver in hand, coat torn open, shouting at us to keep firing. Like he was arguing with the whole damn world not to give up. Back in the Allied lines, the situation map still showed the red arrow reaching Arnhem. Our boys are holding, a staff officer said. Relief should be there by morning. He didn't know that the road north was clogged with wrecked tanks and burning trucks, and that the German 9th SS Panzer Division had turned the entire corridor into a killing ground. At the bridge, the sky turned black with smoke. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and river water. Frost moved from house to house, checking positions, encouraging his men, his voice calm even as bullets punched through the walls around him. As night fell, the defenders heard movement, the clank of armor and the grinding of treads on metal. The Germans were preparing a full assault. Private Tom Ridley, 19 years old, wrote one last line in his pocket notebook before tucking it into his tunic. If anyone finds this, tell them the bridge was beautiful. The narrator's voice fades, low and steady. They thought the flames meant the enemy was retreating. But the fire wasn't theirs. It was the light of search lamps, German spotlights warming up for the hunt. By dawn, the city had no color left. Everything was gray, smoke, stone, faces. That line came from Sergeant William Grayson, one of the last men out of Arnhem. He remembered the second day as the day the bridge stopped being metal and became hell. September 19th, 1944. The morning began with a false calm. The shelling paused, replaced by the distant clatter of armor. Paratroopers crouched in shattered windows, listening. The river below was slick with oil and ash. In one house, Private Evans tried to heat a tin of rations over a candle. The moment he lifted it, a sniper's bullet cracked through the glass and split it in half. "Guess breakfast's canceled," someone muttered. A few men laughed, the short, dry laugh of those who'd forgotten how to stop. Then the bombardment began again. For 6 straight hours, German guns from across the river turned the bridgehead into rubble. Walls buckled, streets vanished under dust. The sky pulsed orange with every blast. A soldier shouted for ammo and got no answer. Another kept firing until his brin jammed red hot. When the smoke thinned, Frost's voice came across the radio, the only line still working. "Hold positions. Conserve what you can." There was no reply. Most radios were dead. Across the street, a Dutch family huddled in a cellar. The mother clutched a small silver cross. The father whispered, "They will save us, yes?" The translator beside Frost didn't answer. By afternoon, the defenders had turned the riverfront houses into fortresses. Stairwells became firing points. Basements became hospitals. The air smelled of blood, plaster, and burned cordite. Inside one of the makeshift aid stations, a medic named McHugh tore up tablecloths for bandages. A shell hit the building across the street. The shockwave blew out every window. When the dust cleared, he found his assistant staring at a wall, deaf, blood trickling from his ears. McHugh just said, "Back to work." Outside, a tank rumbled closer. Its turret rotated slowly, methodically. The men could hear it breathing. That's how one of them described it later, like a monster sniffing us out. They fired a single PIT round. It missed. The tank answered with a shell that split the house open. Half the squad disappeared in the blast. The rest crawled through the rubble, dragging the wounded by their webbing straps. When the firing finally stopped, Frost looked around and said quietly, "That's not an army out there. That's a tide." At that same hour, in the south, XXX Corps was still stalled outside Elst, 16 kilometers away. The roads were clogged with wrecks, ambushed convoys, and dead cattle. The highway to Arnhem had become a graveyard of metal. Radios crackled in headquarters, still advancing, still on schedule. The words were lies even as they were spoken. Back on the bridge, night came early. Smoke turned the sunset to rust. The surviving British huddled in their positions, whispering to each other through the dust. "They'll come tonight," one said. Another answered, "Then let's make it worth it." In a ruined parlor, Captain McKay found a working gramophone. He wound it once, gently, and for a few seconds a scratchy waltz filled the air, something absurdly beautiful amid the chaos. "Keep it playing," Frost said. "Let them hear we're still here." When the shells returned, the music was swallowed whole. At 10 p.m., The Germans attacked again, infantry this time, supported by flamethrowers. The flames licked across the bridge surface, reflecting off the steel like veins of fire. The heat was unbearable. Bullets sparked off girders. The defenders fired until their rifles smoked. I saw the river glowing, Grayson wrote years later. It was like the water itself was burning. Somewhere near midnight, Frost moved through the ruins with a flashlight, checking every building. Half his officers were dead. He stopped beside a wounded paratrooper who whispered, "We'll make it, sir." Frost looked out at the bridge and said softly, "We already have." In England, the newspapers were printing tomorrow's headlines: "Bridge taken, armor advancing." In reality, the bridge was becoming a grave. By morning, they were down to a few hundred men, out of ammunition, running on stubbornness and pride. The Germans had begun using artillery from both sides of the river, turning the entire area into a cauldron. The city's church tower collapsed, sending bricks cascading into the street like rain. In a lull between bombardments, someone brewed tea using rainwater collected in a helmet. "Best cup I ever had," the man later said. "Probably because I thought it'd be my last." The final order Frost gave that day was simple: hold until you can't. Then hold a bit longer. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. They believed rescue was only hours away. They didn't know the road had already closed behind them. And in the silence between the explosions, you could almost hear the bridge breathing, as if it knew what was coming. When the sun rose, we weren't fighting anymore. We were surviving. The voice on the recording was old, rasped with years of silence. Then came the sound of fire, the faint crackle of burning wood, the distant groan of collapsing steel, a radio sputtering through static. Arnhem, September 20th, 1944. The third day. The bridge still stood, blackened but unbroken, stretching across the Rhine like a scar. Around it, what remained of Frost's men, barely 200, clung to the ruins of half-destroyed houses. Smoke drifted low through the streets, blurring the line between day and night. Frost limped down the corridor of what had once been a tailor's shop, the floor littered with shards of glass and half-burned maps. His right leg was bleeding. A shell fragment had torn through the muscle, but he refused the stretcher. "I can walk," he said. "While the bridge stands, I walk." He passed men huddled behind overturned tables, rifles across their knees. Their eyes were ringed with soot, hands trembling not from fear but exhaustion. One soldier sat with an empty Bren gun in his lap, clicking the trigger idly. "When I squeeze it," he said to no one, "I remember what alive feels like." The ammunition had run out hours ago. Food too. They tore open ration tins meant for the wounded. The water from the Rhine tasted of ash. By mid-morning, the Germans shifted tactics. They stopped storming the bridge and started burning it. One by one, they set the buildings ablaze. Houses that had sheltered British snipers now turned into ovens. Flames crawled up the walls, licking the rooftops. In the basements, the wounded begged for air. The fire found them anyway. Private Grayson wrote later, "The heat was so strong, it felt like the bridge itself was breathing fire. We fired back at silhouettes, ghosts moving in the smoke." A harmonica began playing somewhere in the chaos, a soft tune, ragged but steady. No one knew who started it. Maybe a wounded man, maybe someone just too tired to stop. The notes floated above the burning, defiant and absurdly human. Across the river, the Germans watched through binoculars. Their officer, a major with the 10th SS Panzer Division, lowered the glass and muttered, "They are already dead, but they do not surrender." Then he ordered the shelling to stop. Let them burn themselves out. In the south, the Allied headquarters was drawing up new plans. The phrase "breakthrough tomorrow morning" was penciled across the map. For Frost, tomorrow no longer existed. By noon, the flames had spread to every side of the bridgehead. The sky turned orange-black. Ammunition cooked off inside buildings, erupting like fireworks. The air was thick with dust and the stench of cordite. Frost moved between his men, giving orders that were more ritual than strategy now. "Hold what you can. Don't let them cross." His voice was quiet, steady, almost fatherly. Each time he spoke, the men straightened their backs. He paused in a doorway, watching a burning wall collapse into the street. "If this is the end," he said softly to his adjutant, "then it's a good one." In the shadows of a ruined attic, Corporal Evans peered through a hole in the roof. He could see German armor massing beyond the smoke. Dozens of vehicles, silhouettes shifting in the light. He whispered, "They're coming again." "No," replied the sergeant beside him. "They're waiting. They know we're almost gone." Down below, medics crawled through debris, dragging the wounded by their belts, covering them with tarps torn from walls. The church bell that had rung through the first day was now melted into silence. By afternoon, only isolated pockets of defenders were left. The rest were buried, burned, or bleeding out in basements. A few paratroopers still fired single shots across the river, more to be heard than to hit anything. When the shelling paused at dusk, Frost limped to a window. Across the water, he could see the German tanks glinting in the light. He reached for his radio, its battery nearly dead. "This is Frost," he said, still holding. "Situation critical." No one answered. Only static. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the bridge was still there, glowing faintly in the firelight. It looked almost alive, like a creature refusing to die. Inside the ruins, a handful of men gathered around a small flame from a broken lantern. Someone asked, "You think they'll come tonight?" Frost said nothing. Outside, the wind shifted. The roar of engines rolled from the west, deep, rhythmic, growing louder. Private Ridley, his face streaked with ash, looked toward the sound. "Maybe it's ours," he said, hope rising in his voice. No one replied. The men listened as the noise grew, the metallic grind unmistakable. Tanks. Dozens of them. But the direction was wrong. The sound wasn't coming from the south, it was coming from behind the German lines. Frost leaned his head against the shattered wall, exhaled, and whispered, "Not ours." The harmonica stopped. The narrator's voice fades in, low and even. They listened to the engines long after dark, each man knowing the truth but refusing to speak it. The bridge still stood, but it no longer belonged to them. "We held for 3 days. Then there was only smoke and the taste of metal." The voice on the old reel is steady, like a man walking through memory on thin ice. Evening settles over Arnhem. The bridge still stands, glowing faintly red, the air above it trembling with heat. The German guns are silent now. They have learned patience. In the basements, Frost's men breathe through dust and ash. Doors serve as stretchers. Water tastes of plaster. A medic tears linen from curtains and murmurs names to keep from shaking. Rumor crawls down the stairs. The Allies are across the river, just a kilometer away. Hope stirs, then cracks as another voice says the crossing is gone, blown to fire. Outside, what remains of the town is a skeleton. The wounded have been carried into a half-ruined church. Rain drips through holes in the roof. Bullets carve bright holes in the stained glass. A chaplain holds a cup to a boy's lips. "You're safe here," he says, and they both understand the lie. On the southern road, XXX Corps has stopped again. Burned tanks clog the narrow highway. The ditches shine with oil and death. Someone writes, "Breakthrough tomorrow," on a map in pencil. For Frost, tomorrow no longer exists. The clock reads only now. Night brings no relief. The air burns. In a corner house, a Bren gun fires twice and dies. Its gunner lays it down with care, whispering, "At least it still sounds like life." From the street, a German voice, "Surrender your wounded." Frost leans on a wall, his right leg wrapped in blood. "Tell them," he says quietly, "we'll talk when our men can walk." The runner nods. The lie holds the shape of courage. At midnight, silence settles, not peace but exhaustion. Somewhere above the ruins, a harmonica plays a tune too fragile to finish. Far away, new orders are signed. Withdraw to Oosterbeek. Save who can be saved. Frost never hears them. Dawn, September 21st. The heat has no color. A young German officer writes in his report, "The enemy displayed exceptional stubbornness. No names, no emotion." On the bridge, the last British rifle fires once more, not at a target, but at time itself. A corporal feeds maps into a biscuit tin flame, watching the edges curl into black script. "Keep the fire low," the medic says. "It's all we've got that still makes sense," the corporal answers. Across the river, German armor waits. "They're finished," a driver mutters. "They were finished yesterday," his officer replies. "Today they're deciding what to do with that truth." When the push comes, it is quiet. White cloths at doorways, hands raised because hands can no longer lift rifles. Others are carried out on stretchers, faces gray beneath soot. In the church, the chaplain raises his palm. Enough. The German sergeant nods, signaling water, medics, order. For an hour, men who were enemies carry the same weight through the same smoke-filled aisle. Outside, the bridge radiates a slow warmth like metal remembering flame. No one steps onto it. They simply look at the ruin, the silence, the proof of how long men can stand against arithmetic. On the far bank, a British tanker stares through his periscope at the city a kilometer away. Machine gun fire keeps the distance infinite. So close, he says. So close it hurts. No command can shorten a kilometer of fire. By noon, the smoke thins. Prisoners file past the blackened trusses, faces blank, uniforms gray. The wind lifts ash and lays it down again like tired snow. A paratrooper near the parapet turns his head toward the south, smiling faintly, as if hearing engines that will never arrive. Habit is kinder than truth. The bridge is German again. The ground beneath it belongs to no one. Evening gathers. Somewhere, the harmonica tries one last note, holds it, and lets it die. In the space it leaves, the river begins to speak, soft, endless, carrying away the sound of a city learning what silence costs. Arnhem, September 22, 1944. The bridge is silent. Wind slides through its steel bones, carrying the smell of smoke and oil down to the river. The Rhine moves slowly beneath, black water, thick with the reflection of things already gone. For the first time in days, there are no shots, no engines, no orders. Only the faint crackle of cooling metal and the soft drag of boots among ruins. German engineers begin clearing the bodies at dawn. They work quietly, faces wrapped in cloth against the stench. A medic from the 10th SS kneels beside a paratrooper and touches his sleeve before covering him. Nearby, Dutch civilians step out from cellars with pale faces and empty eyes. They move like ghosts through their own streets, searching for something still alive. One woman bends to lift a British helmet, brushes ash from its rim, and whispers, "They held it for all of us." The town smells of wet plaster and death. Windows gape like mouths. Walls lean toward collapse. From the north bank, frost-captured men are marched through what remains of the bridge approach, bandaged, limping, unarmed. German soldiers watch them pass, not jeering, not cheering, simply watching. For a brief moment, even the victors seem unsure what victory means when the ground itself feels ashamed. In a makeshift hospital inside a former school, the moans of the wounded rise like slow breathing. Frost lies in a corner room, his leg bound in torn cloth. A nurse tells him, in broken English, that the fight is over. He blinks once, then says quietly, "Not over. Just finished for now." When she leaves, he stares at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines of the bridge he can no longer see. A German doctor walks past his bed, pauses, and murmurs, "Your men were remarkable." Frost doesn't answer. He's listening to something else, the sound of the river beyond the walls, steady as a clock that refuses to stop. Across the Rhine, the remnants of the 1st Airborne dig shallow trenches around Oosterbeek. The men are exhausted, faces hollow, uniforms stiff with mud and blood. Rain begins to fall, thin, gray, relentless. It hides tears, cools the burned skin on their hands. A young sergeant writes in his notebook, "We came as lions. Now we dig like rats, but still we wait." Radios crackle with static, then with fragments of coded orders. Operation Berlin has begun, the silent evacuation under the moonless sky. On the night of September 25th, the river becomes a mirror for desperation. Small assault boats cross under black canvas. Each one carries more ghosts than men. Paddles dip without splash. Bullets slice through fog, but find only water. A corporal murmurs, "Don't breathe. Don't think." Behind them, tracer fire sweeps the northern shore where hundreds still hold the line to buy the rest a chance. Some don't make it. The Rhine swallows them without sound. By dawn, only a fraction have crossed, 2,000 out of 10. The others are missing, dead, or captured. On the southern bank, soldiers collapse in mud, too weak to stand. An officer offers cigarettes to trembling hands, his own fingers shaking. A chaplain kneels beside a pile of rifles and prays without words. In the distance, the bridge burns once more, this time from Allied bombs. their own fire meant to keep the enemy from using it. The arc of flame lights the clouds like dawn from a wrong direction. In a captured radio log, a German commander notes, enemy evacuation successful in part. Morale, undiminished. Losses, severe. He underlines the last word twice. Even on paper, the handwriting trembles. Back in Arnhem, the riverbank is lined with graves marked by helmets and bayonets. Children sneak out after curfew to lay flowers. The occupiers do not stop them. The air smells of rain and rust. A local priest writes in his journal, they died for a bridge. But perhaps it was not the bridge. Perhaps it was the idea that something impossible was still worth trying. When Frost is moved from his cot to a prisoner column weeks later, he turns his head once toward the south. He cannot see the bridge. The skyline is empty except for smoke. Lost? A German guard asks him in rough English. Frost shakes his head. No, we just didn't get far enough. The guard doesn't reply, only tightens his grip on the rifle and looks away. For a moment, the two men stand there, sharing a silence that belongs to neither side. By October, the Allied Air Force will bomb what remains of the bridge, leaving only twisted ribs above the water. The Rhine flows on, carrying splinters of stone and steel toward the sea. The locals say at night you can still hear the hum of engines in the wind. Not ghosts, just memory refusing to die. For those who returned, Arnhem became a word heavy with unfinished meaning. For those who didn't, it became a resting place between hope and surrender. The war will continue, snow will fall, cities will burn, and maps will change again. But here, on this stretch of river, the noise has stopped. The narrator's voice drops low. After Arnhem, they learned a new word, almost. They almost won, almost broke through, almost lived. But history remembers the sound that came after. The sound of a bridge breathing out its last smoke into a sky that no longer cared who held it. The wind moves through the steel. The Rhine keeps its rhythm. And somewhere in that endless water, the echoes of those 3 days still turn, circling like oars that never stop. When they took me, my hand stayed in my pocket. Inside was a shard of metal from the bridge, the only thing I wouldn't give up. Boots struck the cobblestones, German voices snapped orders, and the heavy wagon doors clanged shut behind them. They were marched through Arnhem first. The streets were quiet except for the sound of broken glass under boots. Civilians came out from cellars, hollow-eyed, silent. Some wept, others only watched. One old man pressed an apple into a paratrooper's hand. Another woman whispered, "Thank you," in Dutch before vanishing behind a burned doorway. No flags, no cheers, just a line of men moving toward an unknown horizon. At the edge of the city, a German officer halted them. His uniform was immaculate, his tone polite. "You fought like soldiers," he said in careful English. "But war is mathematics, not courage." Frost's men said nothing. The narrator's voice, years later, he was wrong. Mathematics ends battles. Courage keeps them remembered. The prisoners were loaded into freight cars, straw on the floor, one small window for air. Someone scratched a date into the wall, 21/9/44. Another carved the shape of the bridge, its arches trembling as the train jolted forward. Through the slats they saw fields, church spires, the ghosts of rivers slipping away behind them. Stalag 11B. Wire, mud, endless roll calls. A world reduced to fences and waiting. The air smelled of coal dust and cabbage soup. A guard counted them in German, then repeated in English as practice. "You will go home when the war is finished." "Many things finish," a voice answered, "but not all of them go home." Inside the huts, they built a fragile order. A blackboard salvaged from a school became a schedule, lectures, songs, sketches. Someone drew the Arnhem Bridge every evening until the chalk wore to nothing. "You'll wear a hole through the wood," another joked. "It's the only thing I know that still holds," the artist said. A corporal traded chocolate for a pencil and wrote a single line on a scrap of paper. "Captivity is being alive after you've already been taken." They hid it under the floorboard, their secret testament. At night, whispers replaced the sound of gunfire. They spoke of families, of air raids they could almost hear, of the river. A young private said he still had his whistle from the drop. "Blow it," someone teased. He shook his head. "It's for starting things." Winter came early. Frost covered the bucket water, rations thinned. A German guard, a mason before the war, told them, Bricks last longer than men. A sergeant smiled faintly. Unless men hold the bridge, he said. For a heartbeat, they both understood each other. On Christmas Eve, the Dutch prisoners sang softly. The British joined in on the refrain. For 1 minute, the wire vanished. Afterward, no one spoke. A lieutenant finally whispered, "If not us, our sons." No one contradicted him. In prison, even hope needed silence to breathe. Spring thawed the fences. Rumors arrived with the wind, the Allies advancing, the Reich crumbling. The men tried not to believe, afraid to lose the rhythm of endurance. A guard brought a newspaper photo of the bridge, its arches blackened, half destroyed. "Yours?" he asked. "Ours," they said, and for once the word meant everyone who had ever stood beneath its smoke. Letters came, thin as onion skin. "We are safe. Your son walks now. Come home soon." One envelope held a child's drawing, a crooked bridge under a sun that looked like a coin. The man who received it folded the paper into his pocket beside the metal shard, as if one memory needed the other to survive. March 1945. They were moved again. New camp, same fences. The guard counted them by habit, his voice dull. When someone asked, "Where to?" he shrugged. "Forward." The road was mud, lined with fields. A little Dutch girl waved from a ditch. A prisoner lifted his hand in return. Inside his pocket, the shard pressed against his skin, warm from the march. That night, under a sky without stars, one man whispered, "We left Arnhem, but it never left us." Another answered, "Then we aren't lost." The train whistle rose again, soft, almost kind. They stepped into the dark, no flags, no fanfare, carrying the bridge not on their backs, but inside their hearts, where no one could ever take it. The war ended with trumpets and bunting, but Arnhem returned in a whisper. "The guns stopped," a veteran says on an old tape. "Yet a shard of that bridge stayed in me, like glass you never quite remove." Church bells rang again in England. Bands tuned on village greens. Crowds waved flags at the stations where prisoners came home thin and careful with their smiles. A reporter asked one officer how victory felt. He answered without looking at the camera, "We didn't win. We survived." They stepped down from carriages to embraces that hurt in the best way, to tea that tasted of relief, to rooms rearranged by time. Mothers pressed faces into wool. Children hid behind legs, then reached. A man who had counted wire posts like prayers found his kitchen clock unbearably loud. Another slept on the floor for weeks because a bed felt like a trick. When neighbors said, "Arnhem," some nodded and changed the subject. Others left the room. There are words that take more breath than lungs can afford. Across the water, the city stitched itself back together with thread that didn't match. In 1945, the bridge was only ribs, blackened and bent. Dutch workers cleared trusses by hand. Barges carried away the iron like a funeral flotilla. Women in headscarves moved through the ruins with baskets, collecting tags, buttons, photographs bleached to ghosts. They kept them in biscuit tins under beds, a local vow. When someone came asking, something could be given back. In Oosterbeek, new crosses rose in careful rows. The earth opened for 1,400 names. The grass lay down around the stones like a promise. A gardener carried a notebook of plots and letters for families who would never cross the sea. He learned to pronounce Norfolk and Glasgow with Dutch patience. "They belong to us now," a woman said, placing heather beside a stranger's stone, "so that they can still belong to you." The first years after peace were crowded with silence. Veterans avoided reunions. Widows learned the ritual of the mantelpiece. A few men tried to explain and found the words came out like smoke. Others wrote late at night when the house was asleep, lines that folded back on themselves. We were only a pause in history. Sometimes a pause is all that saves a life that comes later. Letters drifted across channels and borders, returns addressed to addresses that no longer existed, parcels of buttons, and a single pipe, a photograph of a dog-eared bridge pinned to a new kitchen wall. By 1947, the hum of rebuilding grew steadier. Concrete climbed where smoke had lived. The new span would not tread the exact footprint of the old. It would come up a little downstream, a practical decision that felt like a wound healing not as it had been. Engineers spoke of load and camber. The townspeople brought coffee to the site and measured progress in mornings without thunder. Children played fairies with bottle caps along the quay and learned 2 sets of names for the same street, before and after. Those who had been prisoners learned the arithmetic of ordinary days. A bricklayer's hands hardened again. A schoolteacher discovered he could no longer stand in front of a class without hearing boots. One man found the shard he'd carried from the bridge had worn smooth in his pocket. He placed it in a drawer and closed it softly, as if telling a companion to rest. Yet when rain came hard on slate, he still heard the old storm. Sometimes the past arrived with a knock. A Dutch parcel in brown paper, twine cross-hatched, a foreign stamp. Inside, a War Office form, a small leather strap, a folded photograph of 3 men on a doorstep with the bridge behind them like a dare. Found in rubble, 1945. Kept safe until an address could be found. The handwriting was patient, almost shy. The recipient sat down at the table because standing seemed too proud for what the moment required. In Nijmegen and Eindhoven, commemorations began, low-key at first, not yet called by grand names. A wreath at a river, a pause at a corner where a house no longer stood. Dutch voices told the story back to those who had lived it, filling in the parts the men could not say. The doors that opened, the apples pressed into hands, the way the river looked when it carried both light and bodies. Some officers returned quietly to the Netherlands, following maps with their fingers as if the paper might bruise. They walked the rebuilt streets and the cemetery rows, laid down a sprig of rosemary, and stood too long without speaking. It was all for a bridge, one said finally. A Dutch guide shook his head. Not for a bridge, for a way across. Both men understood that way meant more than river. By 1948, the new span took shape over the Rhine, a clean curve of intent. From the northern bank, old men judged the silhouette against memory and found it almost right. On a summer afternoon, workers paused to watch swallows threading the girders. A boy asked his father what the bridge would be called. The man said the name did not matter. What mattered was the crossing. Then he touched the boy's shoulder and added, "Names come later, when the living catch up to the dead." The veteran on the tape returns one last time, voice low. "They told us not to talk about Arnhem. We tried, but the river talked anyway." Wind moves in the microphone. You can hear gulls. In a town office, a clerk drafts language for a future ceremony. In a London flat, a former paratrooper folds his demob suit across a chair and wonders whether he could stand on that riverbank again without his legs remembering fire. And in a Dutch attic, a tin of saved objects waits on a high shelf. Tags, letters, a harmonica that will play once more when fingers are brave enough to find the tune. Years will pass. Concrete will cure. A name will be proposed that turns a span of steel into a promise. Survivors will travel by slow buses and careful steps to stand on a bridge that was not there when they bled for it, and yet is the same at heart. The river keeps its steady sound, like breath in a sleeping room, while invitations go out and medals are polished and a speech is written that will try, and nearly fail, to say the exact size of gratitude. August 1977. The Rhine drifts quietly beneath a new bridge. Flags hang still, the crowd hushed, the air heavy with memory. A Dutch announcer speaks. Today we dedicate the John Frost Bridge. Cameras click. Old soldiers stand beside young ones who know their faces from books, not battle. Among them, a thin man adjusts his beret. On his wrist, a pale scar, the ghost of Arnhem. When the orchestra plays, he looks down. The tune is new, but the river's pulse beneath sounds the same. The bridge isn't steel to him. It's voices, smoke, a sky torn open by shells. When the ribbon falls, applause rises, but several men turn away. "We didn't win," one murmurs, "but we never surrendered." Behind them, a German veteran steps forward. He hesitates, then offers his hand. "For Arnhem," he says. The Englishman grips it firmly. "For Arnhem." Cameras lower. The silence between them says more than words. Peace made not by papers, but by memory shared. Children watch from the bank, restless and curious. They don't know how the bridge once burned, only that their parents' eyes grow soft when they speak of it. The veterans salute. The children stand straighter, sensing reverence without knowing its weight. The mayor speaks of friendship, of nations rebuilt. His voice trembles, and the river answers in whispers. When the bugle plays the final note, time folds for a moment. Smoke, shouting, then stillness. The applause fades to wind. Afterward, people linger. A woman lays a photograph on the railing. Her father, age 20, smiling beside the old bridge. He said it would last forever, she murmurs. Maybe he was right. Flowers fill the cracks of the stone. The air smells faintly of rain and engine oil. As evening falls, the steel glows gold. A veteran takes out a dented harmonica and plays a trembling melody. A young Dutch soldier listens, cap in hand. Was it worth it, he asks. The old man studies the water. If you're here to ask, yes. Boats pass beneath, trailing ripples that catch the light. The lamps along the bridge flare one by one, until the whole span seems to hover above the dark water like a memory refusing to drown. People drift away in small groups, their voices low. Only the veterans remain, watching the river move, steady, patient, eternal. The man with the scar walks to the center, leaning slightly on his cane. Below him, the Rhine murmurs in its old language of current and loss. He rests a hand on the railing, its metal warm from the sun, and whispers, "We held it as long as we could." He turns back toward the city lights. Behind him, the bridge gleams, quiet, unwavering, alive. It stands not from concrete or steel, but from the stubborn courage of those who refused to step back when everything else had already fallen. The narrator's voice closes, low and sure. The bridge at Arnhem still stands because of what was endured. Some victories are not measured in ground gained, but in the strength to hold when the world was breaking. The river flows on beneath the arches, carrying silence, reflection, and the faint echo of men who once chose to stay.